Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So, no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to No More, No Less. I'm your host, Michael Chikeen, and today in the virtual studio, I have with me Michelle May. Dr. May is a former family physician and recovered yo-yo dieter. She's the founder of mihungry.com, where she has mindful eating programs and training. Michelle is the author of the Eat What You Love, Love What You Eat book series that teaches mindful eating to help individuals resolve mindless and emotional eating and senseless yo-yo dieting to live the vibrant life they crave. Michelle May, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I guess let's start what appears to be the epicenter of the problem. Why does it seem like every single diet program out there fails in the long term?
Well, statistically, we know they do. There's a lot of research that shows us that they do. I don't know why we keep trying the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. That's the definition.
Right.
What's really happening is probably happening on a number of different levels. For one thing, on a physiological level, we're evolved to survive times of starvation. And although most people know that starvation diets aren't the way to go, even moderate diets, if the body perceives that it's not getting the energy that it needs on a day to day basis, it does what it's supposed to do, which is to save your life. It begins to slow down your metabolism. Food actually smells and looks better. It tastes better. We tampen down our fullness signals. And so, what happens for most people is that even if they are air quote successful for a period of time on their diet, when they go off of it, their body restores their prior body weight, sometimes even more. On a psychological level, we begin to feel deprived of the foods that we're not allowed to have. Ironically, sometimes we even feel deprived of things we didn't even care about before we weren't allowed to have them anymore. So then we start developing cravings for those foods. When we finally give in and eat the foods that we're not supposed to have, it sets off a series of emotions, including guilt and shame and regret and this thought of, well, I've already blown it. I might as well keep eating and I'll start over tomorrow. And so,
Right.
between these very powerful effects, most people, even very successful people, people who don't have any problem with willpower in other areas of their lives, continue to struggle with food.
Yeah, it seems like there's that positive feedback loop that we have with eating that seems to be this outlier variable in all this as well, where people kind of like, as you said, with like emotional eating and things like that, where even if we have great willpower, sometimes it just feels good to have a cookie.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's so many of these crazy diets out there that you think they would have just gone away by now with the detox and the paleo and the carnivore. And I'm honestly, I could probably name them for the whole time of this episode. And you think they would be looking at either more sustainable things instead of just chasing it one after another. So I guess to go forward, I'd like to go back to say, like, how did you end up getting to this place, as a physician, where you felt confident coming forth with this new idea of what it would like to be to have a sustainable diet?
Yeah, like many people who are passionate about what they do, I came here because of my own personal struggles with these issues. I struggled with my body image, I struggled with yo yo dieting, disordered eating, and even an undiagnosed eating disorder from middle school all the way through medical school. And it really wasn't until I was in my medical practice and I began hearing so many similar stories from a lot of my patients who were also succeeding in other areas of their lives
Hmm.
that I began to think, wait a minute, if I can't do it and they can't do it, maybe there's something wrong here. And
Right.
that was just the kernel of beginning to approach this issue from a completely different direction.
Okay. And was there a first model that you used to try to come up with this new paradigm of eating? Was it like Iron Man tinkering in his lab until he finally had his suit to come together, or how did you find a way until you're like, I've got it. This thing will work for me and everybody else.
Well, I'll tell you, ironically, the initial model for me was my own children. I had two young children at the time, and I watched them eat with total abandon. They weren't interested in food when they weren't hungry. When they were hungry, they really only wanted to eat what they really enjoy. Now we fed them obviously a variety of foods, but they weren't inclined to eat something just because it was good for them.
Hmm.
And similarly, they wouldn't keep eating even if the food was amazing, which was very different from my pattern and the pattern of a lot of people that I've worked with since then. Yes. So
Yeah.
we yeah, so we'll, they would eat what they loved, but if they were full or had enough, then they wanted to go play. And I thought, that's it. We were all born with the instinctive ability to know when we needed fuel, to stop when our tank was full, and then to go use that fuel without thinking of it as punishment or earning the right to eat.
Huh.
And then when we're done and the full fuel gets low again, we eat again. And that's what I wanted.
That is fascinating. So for me, I have a pretty good discipline for like I don't really have any vices. You know what I mean? Like my phone is probably the biggest one, unfortunately. But sometimes if I'm especially if I mentally have checked out from a meal, as in like I'm at Christmas or whatever, I will just eat until I do not feel good. And I think I used to do it more in the past. And so I wonder, as you call it, emotional eating, is it also ironically is it also emotionally disconnected eating?
Yes, I think that's a really important point. People don't just eat more food than they need for emotional reasons, although that's a big factor for some people. We often eat mindlessly. So as you said, disconnected, we're not paying attention. We've lost track of the sensations of satiety. And when we're not aware, when we're not focused, we forget that the results of eating that way are going to leave us feeling overly full and uncomfortable afterward.
Gotcha. Yeah, because the way I was looking at it is that like if you're clearly overeating because you're anxious or because you're nervous or shame or whatever these things, these are the emotions that are driving that behavior. But it's not so it obviously it is emotional eating, but it's not like we're recognizing it because I think we end up becoming so disconnected from our emotions. Maybe we're ignoring this emotion and that emotion, and then it's just
Mhm.
driving the bus straight towards a Burger King or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, so you're touching on, I think, some really important points of this. And again, another reason that diets are so ineffective. Diets focus on what you're eating and how much you're eating. They almost completely ignore why you're eating in the first place, how you're eating your food, and then what you're doing with the energy besides exercise. And
Right.
so, those are all the important points that we want to look at when we're helping somebody heal their relationship with food. So, to back up a little bit, emotional eating is normal. It is part of eating to sometimes eat for comfort. We connect with food. We get pleasure from eating. We sometimes disconnect by eating. And so that's part of the normal experience. Where it becomes a problem for somebody is when they're using food to stuff down or ignore their emotions or numb themselves from their emotions, and then they're much more likely to be able to eat a lot of food without recognizing how full they're feeling until it's too late.
Hmm.
But the other issue, of course, with this is that we live in an abundant food environment. We live in an environment where we are constantly exposed to the opportunity to eat. We don't have to work very hard to get food anymore. And so it becomes a very easy way to get pleasure or distraction or even deal with boredom. And so I think
Hmm.
oftentimes we forget that it's not really just these deep, dark emotions that can cause eating, but it's sometimes just habitual reaching for food because it's there.
Right. There's a book I read a long time ago called Mindless Eating by, I think, Brian. Does that
One
sound familiar?
sink. One
What's
sink.
that's
Uh-huh.
exactly. I knew there's a reason I didn't remember that last name. Um, and the all of the premises in that book really stayed with me. The idea that if you were to give people just a bigger bowl to eat out of, they're going to eat more. If you're going to have something that is, I think they had like a bottomless popcorn bowl or something like that, and people just kept going and going and going and going. Like
Mhm.
all of these things that we don't even think of, especially in the U.S., for example, where portions are just so crazy enormous, and the amount of like sugar in some products that maybe not wouldn't be available, let's say here in Europe or in Canada, or things like that, that these aren't things that we're actually just out of control. We're not satiated. Like these are things that are designed into the food system
Mhm.
to help people have more cravings or just consume more products, so to speak.
Right. And I think the operative word there is mindless
Right.
because we have gotten into mindless habitual eating. There's a lot of cues in our environment. There's a lot of financial motivation
Mm,
for people to sell us more food. But even from the time we're little, I mean our parents, a caregiver who makes us clean our plate before we get dessert in a way is doing the same exact thing. And so we can unlearn the ability to notice our own satiety signals from a very young age.
mm,
And when you live in an abundant food environment and you can't tell when you're full, then that can backfire. And the other complicated piece of this is that because we're a culture that does so much dieting and restriction, we have so many good food, bad food rules. Even if we're not
right.
talking about weight, we're talking about health, we're still making foods good and bad. And so when somebody eats something that they perceive as bad and feel guilty, or they start telling themselves that they're not going to eat that again, then
Mm.
it's even more likely to shut off the satiety signals because they're going to get all they can now while they're eating it, and then they won't repeat that behavior. So it's not as simple as we often hear to eat less and move more. It's much more complicated than that, which is why I think mindfulness and mindful eating, which is my little corner of this field, is really the missing piece for so many people.
I really love that. Yeah, because it seems like the eat less, move more is is simple and maybe scientifically has some validity to it, but it doesn't make it easy. And the part that changes from simple to easy is all these psychological factors that go into kind of like how we live our life, where we live. Do you walk more often? Do you sit more
Mhm.
often? Like all of these little things that go way beyond calories in, calories out. So it's like the tip of the iceberg where like
Right.
calories in, calories out, or eat less, move more is at the top. And then underneath is everything that's built into your life when you're feeding kids, like animal crackers and you haven't eaten. So you're just shoveling animal crackers in your mouth and like all of these little things. I mean, for me, I think I was in my early 30s, and I read a really cool Men's Health article about intermittent fasting. This is before it was really trendy. And this was just like to do it once a week for 12 or 36 hours to really help with your, I think they phrase it like your cells, your mitochondria, like all these things on a different perspective than weight loss. And so I was doing my first one for 24 hours, and it was super hard. And I realized my brain was just addicted to eating. It thought I had to eat all the time. If I didn't, I was scared there was going to be a problem. And I think it was like the third week of doing that where I finally disconnected this fear response in my brain. And all of a sudden, I seemed to completely reboot how I looked at food. And so it's even helped me today. So if I'm on a road trip and we can't stop for another hour, even though I'm hungry, I don't really get that hangry sort of situation. Like
Hmm.
I just get annoyed. And then I'm like, all right, I guess I'll wait till. But it's really changed how I look at food as far as necessity. And so where do you start with your clients to maybe have that disconnect where they can have that millisecond between like emotional response and Oreo or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, well, just to back up before I answer that, I want to acknowledge that what you're talking about is experiential learning. It's the way people learn best. It's inside out. In other words, you experience something, you then practiced, observed, learned this new way of thinking or behaving. Diets are outside in. Some expert is telling you what you can and can't eat, what time you eat, the whole business.
Hmm.
And it's not sustainable. I mean, many people would have given up on your experiment within one or two tries. You stuck with it and learned something about yourself. But I think you said you the difference between what you are doing and a lot of the people that I work with is you trust yourself to feed yourself when you need food. You can sustain hunger, you can tolerate hunger for an hour because you trust that you're going to be able to feed yourself when you finally have an opportunity. When people are dieting, it's always out there that they shouldn't be doing this or they won't be allowed to have that. And
Hmm.
so that trust in the relationship with food is lost. And that makes it very difficult for people to even tolerate something like hunger or tolerate something like not being able to eat their favorite food because they don't trust that they're going to be allowed to have it again. And it creates an adversarial relationship with food. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Actually, I have a quick question. So I would imagine a lot of people that come to you have tried every diet in their life since they've been 20 years old, and they're just kind of sick, and they realize that these things aren't going to work. They're probably obese, if not morbidly obese, or somewhere in between. Do you find, because I was thinking this because you said there's so many rules that you can't do this, you can't do that. This food's good today. This food's bad tomorrow, and it must get so confusing. Do you come to people that feel completely confused and lost when they even look to the grocery store or what they should eat each day?
Yeah, so that's a really important piece of this. And let me just say first of all that I work with people of all sizes. You might not know it because this isn't your work, but you might not realize that this struggle with food that I'm talking about affects everybody. I mean, it really isn't an issue of size, and not everybody who lives in a larger body has a struggle with food. So we have to, that's kind of one of our cultural myths that we have to undo in order to fix this problem with food. Because we immediately assume that what you eat, it automatically affects what you weigh. I mean, I don't mean, I know that it affects what you weigh. Obviously it does, but we always make assumptions about it unless we look beyond the tip of the iceberg. So,
Right.
backing up to what you said, yes, people come in, they're completely confused. They're confused because the rules are constantly changing. So, just to use an example you gave earlier about intermittent fasting, when I was growing up, the rule was you had to eat breakfast. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day.
Right.
And then there's intermittent fasting, which is don't eat breakfast. And this is one of many examples. Many people talk about eating on a schedule. Don't let yourself get hungry. On the other hand, then again, there's intermittent fasting. Back when I was dieting a lot, it was a low fat diet. That was all the rage. You
Right.
had to count nuts and you weren't allowed to have avocado and peanut butter and
Right.
almonds and things that we now know for are healthy fats. And so the irony is people are incredibly confused about what to eat, how much to eat, when to eat, etc. And again, it's because that's an outside in approach. What we need to be able to do this sustainably is an inside out way of making decisions.
Okay. And yeah, I appreciate that delineation for some of the clients that you have that's all body types. And that would make sense because even, you know, myself, I haven't always been in great shape. There was times when I was like, oh, let's eat these 6 meals a day that I saw in this magazine. Oh, let's not do that. And it really wasn't until I started doing those experimental fasts and obviously reading a lot more scientific based research, things like mindless eating, etc., that I realized that all these diets are complete nonsense. I think where I was thinking about it is that seeing that, and there are people in my life that have been like online marketers for fitness products, and I've seen some of the some, for better or for worse, to be honest, but I've seen some of the forums that they've had for their customers, and the things that they've said is that a lot of them have been dieting for 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
and it's only at that point that they feel so exhausted that they end up looking for something that makes more sense, which is something like what you have approached, where something that they're not looking for something that just feeds fast results. They're looking for more of a holistic approach. But
Yeah.
that, unfortunately, it does take a lot of people like 40 years because
Yeah,
like
that's really the shame about the work that I do is that unfortunately, because the diet message, the cultural messages that are out there are so loud and so prevalent,
Mm.
it takes people a long time to reach the point where they even begin to look for something that is more logical.
And so the question I want to come back to is, when you have a new client that comes to you, what is step one for them? They come to you and they're like, Michelle, I'm exhausted from this dieting. I feel like a complete failure because every diet I try, I either I just don't stick with it, or I stick with it for 2 months and then it completely falls off the wagon. Like what do you do for someone like that?
Well, the first step is what we've done here, which is to demystify what's really going on. Because one of the things that is very common in the people I work with is they feel that they have failed. They
Right.
often feel that they've been doing something wrong. They feel guilty, ashamed. They feel hopeless. And I need to correct that perception and make them understand that their experience is the normal experience. This is
Hmm.
what happens to the vast majority of people. And once they can see that, okay, wait, this isn't just me, this is the product of this restrictive approach to eating, then we can move back toward that instinctive, that mindful approach that we were talking about earlier. So once they understand that they were born with the instinctive ability to manage their eating, it's really a matter of relearning those skills. So let me give you an analogy that I love that really helps.
Sure.
So if you're driving down the highway, or what do you call it in Spain? Freeway, highway?
I think it'd be like the autopista. So it'd be
Okay.
complete. Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
And you see a gas station, a petrol station, fuel station, whatever you call it, wherever you live, you don't automatically pull off the road and fill up every time you see it. You check your fuel gauge first, right?
Hmm.
You look to see, do I actually need fuel? And if you just pulled in and topped off every time you saw a gas station, you really wouldn't get very far. You would spend a lot of time consuming fuel and not making any progress. And so I help people understand that your signals of hunger are your body's way of letting you know that your fuel levels are getting low. So we talk about what those symptoms are, what causes them, and how to differentiate between a little bit of hunger and a lot of hunger. So back to your story, you brought up earlier that if you're on a road trip and you're hungry, but it's going to be an hour before you can eat, you can tolerate that. You know you're going to get to food sometime soon.
Right.
If you're famished, you may not want to wait for, another hour or two to eat. So we just talk about really relearning how to identify this natural fuel gauge that we all have.
Right. Yeah. Even if I was famished now, I think because of all the fasts I've done, I'm able to, I think, embrace reality now and be like, okay, this hunger isn't going to kill me. This is just an uncomfortable feeling at the moment. And I'm eventually going to eat and it's going to be fine. Whereas before, there was just like me allowing my emotion to take over how I felt and be like, I'm hungry. Rawr, here comes the Hulk. I'm hungry. And there was no reason behind it. There was just like I had to follow this feeling as immediate as possible, no matter if we had to swerve off into the woods and kill a deer. And I will bring that deer and eat it right now. But like these were the kind of feelings I had at that time. And so my question is, when you're teaching someone and demystifying all of these things within the diet industry, once they understand that they can check their own fuel gauge, do you also take like a holistic approach for what their life looks like as well, and be like, oh, okay, you probably shouldn't have bags of chips just sitting in the hallway or whatever because you know you're going to eat them. Like, and I'm talking about personal experience for me. Like, I can't. My rule is if I want to eat some sort of like chocolate or chips or trash, I have to go leave the house to get it. If it's too easy here, if I'm having a bad day, those are gone.
Well, okay, so yeah, so you've said a few things here that I think are relevant to this. So one is that I never tell people what they can and can't eat. That's not my job.
Right.
I want this to, in order for it to be sustainable, to be an inside out approach. So I teach them how to recognize the patterns that are occurring, the triggers that cause them to reach for certain kinds of foods or to have an inability to stop eating those foods once they start. And I teach them that all foods are permissible, all foods are allowed, all foods are options, and that when they are making choices for themselves, it's so much about balancing eating for enjoyment and eating for nourishment.
Hmm.
And when they get into a mode of restriction, deprivation, then binging on chips or sweets or whatever, they don't feel good. So
Right.
eating the right amount of food or the kinds of foods that nourish us is more about feeling good, not being good, which is why I stay out of the lane of telling people what they should and shouldn't eat, but I guide them to start to notice the effects of their choices so that they have their own built-in ability to make those decisions in the future.
Interesting. Okay, I didn't expect that. That's really interesting because I wasn't at all saying that should be restrictive, as in like you cannot eat this. And for me, I definitely have. I don't know. I'll go for a gelato. I'll have chocolate this or whatever fairly often in my life, but I don't have it in the house because I know my own habits. That if
Mhm.
it's there and I'm bored or whatever, I'll be more likely to graze, as my mom used to say when I was living at home. You're like a grazing cow. You just eat all day. It doesn't. I'll just walk
Right?
around. And so I was wondering, are there any of those lifestyle sort of situations that you do advise of, or no? It's completely like how you
No, no,
feel.
no. Yeah, I'm not going to tell them not to keep foods in their house, but we go through a process where they start to figure out what works for them. So,
Huh,
what you're talking about here is what we would call environmental triggers versus emotional triggers.
right.
Environmental triggers is it's there. It's in my house. Even if I'm hungry, I'm more likely to reach for the chips just because they're there. If
Hmm.
they're not there, then I might take the time to peel an orange or whatever. I mean, you could use a bunch of different examples. And having food in your home that is highly palatable, like the kinds of foods you've mentioned, might be the kinds of foods we're more likely to reach for when we are bored or stressed or looking for some pleasure. So I understand your decision not to keep that in your house. And for some of the people I work with, that's a great choice for them at first. But we teach a process called fearless eating. And fearless eating is about not making foods the enemy anymore because of the things I talked about before. When we make foods good and bad, they actually gain power over us. We actually put them up on a pedestal that makes us think about them and crave them more than we did before.
Hmm.
Now you obviously have a pretty healthy relationship with food. You've decided not to keep foods in your house, but you allow yourself to go out and have them when you really want them, and so that's not so much a challenge for you. But when I'm working with somebody who is binging on certain foods or, isn't able to really nourish themselves in a way that's meeting their health needs or goals or whatever it is, then we really work on what is that relationship with food? What is your and I know relationship with food sounds like a bizarre thing, but it's something that we interact with on a daily basis multiple times a
Sure.
day. It truly has an interplay with the way that we feel. There's a strong mood food connection and food mood connection. And so
Right.
helping people recognize that, we have an actual process that I take them through that helps them look at the decisions they're making around food so they can begin to clarify what's really happening. Am I binging on cookies because I deprive myself of cookies, or I'm thinking I'm bad and I'm not going to be allowed anymore?
Hmm.
Am I binging on cookies just because they're there and I didn't take the time to provide other food for myself? Am I binging on cookies because I actually have a big hole in my life of pleasure and that's where I'm trying to meet my needs? And do I need to take care of that instead?
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I'm wondering all the other things that are outside of um, just regulating how we feel and understanding how we feel for how we eat. And I'm just wondering because I'm thinking of someone I used to know who just would not eat vegetables. This was a dude even into his like late 20s, early 30s, just would not touch a vegetable. Like it'd be potato, meat, maybe a piece of fish, but like it was like vegetables he was allergic to. Like it's unbelievable. And so do you ever have people like that have such negative associations with healthy food that will help satiate you that you actually have to go ahead and undo those habits and kind of wrestle with their psychology a little bit?
Yeah, so that isn't a person that would probably come to see me. That doesn't sound like a person who would identify with the kind of work I do.
Okay.
In fact, they might avoid me because they don't want to eat vegetables. I have a couple of brother-in-laws who are similar to what you're talking about, and it does seem to
Okay.
be men more than women. And I
Oh,
think
for sure.
some children have very very powerful taste buds that really detect bitterness, and things that I might enjoy in Brussels sprouts or kale they would find repulsive. And sometimes, especially if they're forced to eat those foods as a child, they can develop some real emotional negative connections to those foods, and that can carry all the way into adulthood.
Hmm.
And not that some adults aren't super tasters also, they may be. And so that's not really my field. There are registered dietitians who work with people like that, and children especially.
Hmm.
But in my work, most of it is around healing the relationship with food, and oftentimes the people I work with, as you mentioned before, they have a long history of multiple attempts at dieting. I have some people who've already had bariatric or weight loss surgery.
Wow.
They've tried everything. It's not because they're weak willed, it's not because they lack knowledge, it's not because somebody hasn't told them they should eat more vegetables. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that a lot of people who have been on this path for a long time probably know more about nutrition than most doctors do. I didn't
Hmm.
learn a lot about nutrition in medical school. I learned it when I was studying after the fact, doing this kind of work, that I really became much more knowledgeable about nutrition. But my clients who've been on every diet in the book, they know about protein and macronutrients and the importance of vegetables. They're really
Right.
clear. The last thing they need is one more expert telling them to eat more vegetables. They already know that. So what we have
Right.
to do is help them figure out why they're doing what they're doing and how to help them make decisions that work for them.
Right. So while you're answering, I was trying to understand why a person that like that guy I know and like your brother-in-laws would be less likely to come to you. And it seems like, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that they seem so closed off to any new information? Like they're actually not looking for holistic answers. So maybe they'll follow something that only feeds their like all of their confirmation bias. So if they don't want to eat vegetables, then these guys are more likely to go to a carnivore diet or a whatever that other really popular one is where you're only eating essentially meat. Then I think is
Keto.
that as keto? That's it. Is that more accurate?
Maybe, and that probably is, but
Right.
I'm pretty clear that what I work with people on is breaking what I call the eat, repent, repeat cycle. What
Okay.
I help people do is normalize their relationship with food. Many of the people that I can help the most have a disproportionate amount of their time, effort, energy, and money being spent on eating less, eating the right foods, then overeating the foods that they then regret. And so the people
Hmm.
that I mostly help with are really out of balance in the way that they view their eating. And I can help them get to a place where food becomes food and they can, make decisions like, well, okay, I'm not going to keep chips in the house, but I'm going to keep chocolate in the house because that's a food that I enjoy sometimes. They may get to a point where they are able, many of them will say, I don't binge anymore. I'm not having these episodes where I'm eating half of a pizza
Huh.
and, then eating a half carton of ice cream because I don't need to do that anymore. It doesn't happen to me anymore. Those are the people who I seem to have the most success working with.
Gotcha. And I'm really curious because from my knowledge, the only real diet plans that seem to have worked over the last 30, 40 years are things like Jenny Craig or Weight Watchers, where there was a specific like tracking what you eat and being sure you're in the caloric deficit, or even like MyFitnessPal, for example, in which anyone I know that have used that has lost some weight. And so I wonder if someone needs to stay, and maybe we disagree on this, if someone needs to potentially stay in a caloric deficit, how is you know mindful eating in your sort of program help people? Because I've seen people that are like super short, like let's say 5'1" or 5'2", where they just need so much fewer calories to lose weight than someone, let's say like me, I'm 5'10", or let's say even people that are 6 feet that I have a friend who's 6'5" and he can eat for days, and he's always thin because he's just burned so much more fuel than I would, for example. So I wonder what you think about those things.
Well, I think we have to back up a little bit because I want to know your definition of works. If you're talking about short term weight loss, anything works. Like you said, all it is a caloric deficit. It's just math at first.
Right.
What the problem is that our culture sees somebody change their body size and say, "Oh, see, this works." And then when they return to their prior body size, then the person is the one who failed, not the diet. In fact, if you look at the research, and I'll send you a link to a paper, a review paper that I was a co-author on, where we actually looked at a lot of research about dieting, and it's not there long term because that's what people are trying to do. They're trying to make a change long term.
Right.
Long term, very few of any kind of intervention makes a difference long term.
Okay.
People almost always return to their prior body size, if not more. And that's because of some of the things we talked about at the beginning about the physiological and psychological effects of restricting your eating. And so I don't, yes, Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig and anything works if all you're trying to do is take off a little bit of weight for a short period of time. It's
Hmm.
the sustainability, which brings me to what your real question was, which is, if people do they need to log? Do they need to write everything down? How do they need to stay in a caloric deficit? Well, the truth of the matter is that even that kind of behavior doesn't last long term. It creates what I was telling you before. So many of the people I work with of all types of bodies end up spending too much time and energy thinking about food. You go back to think about my children who inspired me to start thinking about this differently. They never wrote down what they ate. They had no idea what a calorie was. They didn't
Right.
need that kind of external information to make a decision about their eating. They had the internal cues. Now, granted, many, I would say the majority of adults have become disconnected from those cues, but they can be relearned. And once they are,
Hmm.
you don't need to weigh, measure, and count food anymore. You don't need to look things up or write things down. Having said that, there is a big place here for nutrition knowledge and information and data that can help us. But I think the most valuable part of awareness is beginning to make connections between when I eat and what I'm feeling, or what I eat and how I feel afterward, and what those cues are. If we can begin to make those connections, then that awareness can help take us out of this constant obsession about food or not eating food.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because let me tell you how I was thinking about that idea of being in a deficit, and maybe this is just you wouldn't feel that same way. Because I would think if you're someone that has been yo-yo dieting for 20 years, 40 years, etc., and it's it would seems likely to me, obviously, who's in this field, that there is a part that when you're uncomfortable with hunger, then you're just going to fill it with food. So you're probably not used to being so hungry because you will immediately answer that call, and maybe it comes from anxiety, all these other things that you mentioned with emotional eating. And so I was wondering how through mindful eating do you end up in a caloric deficit for long enough to lose weight, to go down to a healthy weight and sustain that? Because in my mind, I think like, well, you have to be comfortable being a little bit hungry so you're in that deficit, or am I wrong?
Well, okay, so we're going to go in a different direction here.
Sure.
I'm not going to say that you're wrong, but I will say that we differ in our perspective on this. So there was a study done. You're familiar with the Biggest Loser show that was a huge hit a while back. Well,
Hmm.
there was a very elegant study where they took all the season participants in one year. I think one didn't participate, and they admitted them to the hospital and did all kinds of metabolic and blood work and all kinds of body composition testing, the whole works, like the whole big workup.
Right.
Then at the end of the season, they repeated all the results, and they showed that yes, indeed, people had lost a significant amount of weight, and their body metabolism was significantly lower, which made sense because, as you pointed out with your tall friend, people in smaller bodies might need less energy than they did when they were carrying a larger body around.
Hmm.
Then they re-measured them, I forget the interval, a year, 2 years later. And lo and behold, most of them had their body weight was getting closer to what they started the season at. They had regained much of their weight, except for one outlier. And their metabolism was still as low as it was at the end of the season. Their body was larger, but they were burning the number of calories that they would have burned when they were in a smaller body. Do you see the math here? What happens then is they've been eating less, they lost weight, then even though their weight was coming back, they still needed less calories to sustain their body weight. So
Right.
the it is a physiological fact that when you do ignore hunger and deprive and that sort of thing on a chronic basis, like a sustained diet, then it actually does backfire.
Hmm.
So that's what the research shows us. We've known this for a long time, and we see it all around us. I mean, how many friends have you known who have lost weight on some crazy thing, and you see them a year later and they're back to where they were before? I mean, that's the pattern.
Right.
So that requires a very significant shift in thinking about what it is we're trying to accomplish here. If we're focused on body weight as an outcome, as the most important outcome, then we're not taking a holistic approach at all. If we really want to focus on a person's well-being, we want to look at the overall picture, body, mind, heart, and spirit. And we're not just going to look at one measure like body weight to tell whether somebody's healthy. We can look at their cardiovascular profile. We can look at their genetics, their family history. We really want to look at their activity levels because we know that a person's physical activity and physical fitness are more correlated with their health than their body size is. And so it becomes more complicated when we let go of the simplistic belief that a person's body weight determines their health. When we
Right.
start to say, some people in larger bodies live a long time, some people in very small bodies don't, and start to disconnect the belief that body weight automatically confers health or automatically confers illness.
That's great. I do like the nuance between that, because it seems very obvious now that at some weight, when you're getting bigger, you're pretty objectively unhealthy. And the same if you're too thin, for example. But there is a lot of research that I've been reading recently that seems like, yeah, there is this idea of skinny fat, that just because someone is thin, it doesn't mean that their body composition is healthy. It doesn't mean that what they eat is healthy. It doesn't mean that they have any sort of fitness ability that isn't detracting from the rest of their life because their mobility is very bad and all these things. So I think that is a really important point. And going back to what you said, I was wondering, so where do you think between the Biggest Loser, where they all made mistake not made mistakes, but they all reverted back to their prior weight? Where do you think what you do, how does that help people more, for example, and keep on a sustainable path? And because I'm having a hard time understanding how people, like, this is the reason I wanted to have you on, because I believe in mindful eating. I believe that emotions drive, aside from circumstance and environment, emotions drive a lot of why we will overeat. We're trying to fill something, either if it's an emotion or or hunger. So I just really wonder how you think people are losing weight without knowing they're in a caloric deficit and all these things. I'd love to know, like, how that signal and lever those levers work.
Well, so again, we kind of differ. We sort of differ on this level.
Right.
I'm not saying that I always felt this way, but now that I've been doing this work for 25 years, I feel really strongly that we've been led astray by believing that changing somebody's body size is the solution to this issue.
Right.
And let me give you a few thoughts, because I know that's what your podcast is all about, is to begin to think differently and to begin to look beyond the surface or the assumptions that we make.
Mm-hmm.
So you made a statement earlier about, there's a certain body size at which people are going to be automatically objectively unhealthy. And I would argue with that, but I think, yes, we do see 100%. We definitely see an increase in certain problems and diseases and other kinds of things. But let's look beyond the surface of the body weight and let's look at a few other factors that might be affecting this. Certainly, genetics has a big role to play here. But also, people in larger body sizes, first of all, they have weight cycled. Most of them have been on and off diets through their whole life because they've been told their whole life that their body should be smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that weight cycling in and of itself is associated with certain conditions. Another huge factor is that stigma, weight stigma, the kind of bias that people face in our culture has a big effect on their overall quality of life. So, for example, we live in a world that is not made for large bodies. Even though a higher percentage of people live in larger bodies, the world is not made for those bodies. People are criticized, they're stigmatized, they may be bullied, they may not feel welcome at a fitness center. And so they may face weight stigma at their own doctor's office, where instead of doing the testing and providing the advice that they might give somebody in a small body, they tell them to lose weight. But
Right.
we've already established that weight loss interventions don't work long term. They don't make the difference. They don't change body size significantly. And so ultimately, they are denied health care and instead told to do something that already has been scientifically proven ineffective. Could that be the reason that people die, or one of the reasons that people die at a higher rate of cardiovascular disease or other conditions if they're not even getting the care, or they're facing stigma, which is highly stressful, raises cortisol, raises all the stress hormones that in fact actually increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. So I'm not saying that weight is not an issue at all. I'm not anti weight loss per se. What I'm saying is that our culture is so weight centric that we sometimes don't look beyond weight as the determining factor of somebody's well-being. And so if we really want to help somebody, let's look at the big picture. Let's look at their lifestyle, their physical activity, the way that they're eating. Let's look at their genetics. Let's look at their satisfaction with their work, their ability to live their life fully, the other things that are playing a factor here. I
Right.
mean, social determinants of health. Your zip code is far more predictive of your overall health than your BMI, because we know that these things are real. These external factors are significant and they have a big effect on somebody's health.
Right. Yeah. Even at the mention of BMI, I watched a quick video today where it said sometimes people are getting undiagnosed on the lower end of BMI because they're shown to be in that um, golden range or whatever, but they're not really. It doesn't tell about their body composition and things like that. And there are people that are very muscular or a little bit outside the regular BMI
Yeah.
range that are perfectly healthy. So where I do agree with you, I think I like to. There's a lot of situations now that need more nuance where I think two things can be correct at the same time or valid at the
Yes.
same time. Where obviously there are people that are overweight or obese that are going to the doctors and trying to get answers for the way that they feel, and they're completely dismissed. I think we've seen 100 of these articles and firsthand accounts and studies, and that's awful. If someone has a real issue, nobody wants to be dismissed at the doctor when they're feeling like
No.
their health or their life is at risk. So I think there we completely agree. Where I think we might like I think there could be like a body positivity sort of movement, but also the reality of, let's say, maybe more some European countries, let's say, Spain, France, Italy, for example, where it's not exactly like fat shaming, but your family or your friends, if you're gaining weight, it'll be like, what's going on? You're getting a little fat. Like, and it's more like just baked into the culture where it's not rude. It's kind of just people just, like everyone's gravitating towards this norm of what is healthy and acceptable. And these are traditionally healthier societies than, let's say,
Mhm.
Canadian American sort of culture, even the UK to an extent. And so it's hard to say what all these factors are, because in Europe you are walking more. There is difference in the food supply, like Medicaid, like there's all these things baked into it. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it is hard to pin it down. So you really are trying to split an atom here to
Yeah.
create a weight loss plan for every single person that sees you.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate what you're saying because it is complex, and I'm not, and I, in a podcast, we have the obligation to try to simplify and clarify. But if anybody comes away from here thinking that they've got all the answers, I want you to email me and let me know what the answer is.
Right.
I think really what we're talking about here is that it is not eat less, exercise more. And I would be curious to know if family members in Europe that tell other family members they're getting fat, I would be curious to know whether that really makes a difference. Because in my work, many, many, many of my clients have been told by actually very loving, caring family members, as well as maybe caring doctors who are concerned about them, have given them weight loss advice or criticized their body, and that has not made the difference. That is not what changes people. Ultimately, we have to get beyond the surface. What do you look like, or what do I think I know about you by looking at your body size? We really
Right.
need to be more, as you said, nuanced about this and understand that a person in a very small body who is not physically active, maybe not eating healthy, maybe has even an eating disorder or maybe an undiagnosed cancer or thyroid issue or something else, that we can't assume that that person is healthy. And I would argue that we
Right.
can't assume that a person in a larger body is automatically unhealthy. We have to get more clear about and let's just take a step back and say, is it any of our business anyway? Could we even promote a culture that feels less inclined to judge others based on external attributes? Could we even just step back from assuming that we know something about somebody just by looking at them? I think we're getting to a place where we need to be much much more open to the idea that people have a right to live in the body that they have. And we're not just talking about body size here, of course. There's all kinds of things that people make judgments about. Maybe that's part of the problem that we need to solve here.
Right. Yeah, I think that's part of it. Like I think I don't think anyone well, I don't think most people want to insult and make loved ones or other people feel uncomfortable with how
But it
their
does,
body
though.
looks or
But it
it
does. To be
it,
really
it
clear, it does. It makes people feel othered and makes people feel bad and it makes them self-conscious. And none of those things actually, for the vast majority of people, is going to change their body size. What changes
right.
people's body size is if they are going to start to eat according to their body's needs, if their metabolism hasn't been totally ruined by decades of yo-yo dieting, if they are, and I mean, I have to be honest with you. Sometimes I've worked with people who were binge eating and really struggling with that, and they don't anymore, and their body size doesn't change that much,
Right.
but their life changes significantly because they're no longer thinking about food all the time or feeling bad about themselves or feeling out of control. They are in charge, and they're not using food to try to stuff emotions. They're learning how to manage their emotions, recognize their emotions, and use food in a way that's much more balanced. So again, it's pretty nuanced, and I
Right.
don't have the simple answer that everybody wants, but I can tell you that what we've been doing for 100 years or more is not working. And in fact, I would argue that it's actually contributing to the increase in body size on average in our cultures.
Right. Well, culture. I think maybe this conversation also is more important to put it as like American centric, for
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
and that's why I was really looking forward to this conversation because there is so much nuance in eating between culture and country and things like that. Whereas
Yeah.
I think what you're doing is probably the best way to do it as far as like managing emotions because I think it takes everything into account opposed to like just restricting and I think like you're
Mm.
saying like it really sets off so many other alarm bells. And but where I would love to hear your opinion is my point about cultures earlier is that I think it wasn't so much in some of these European cultures that is about shaming, and sure that does exist, but I think at least somewhere sometimes in I think I can include Canadian culture in this a little bit, but American culture is that there's kind of this reality distortion field, whereas like let's say someone is getting very unhealthy or they are losing weight, instead of like either not saying anything or being honest, it's this kind of the usurping of reality. Be like, no, you look great. Let's just go get bigger clothes, and those don't fit. Let's just go get bigger clothes, and it seems to feed sort of some side like an unhealthy sort of habit rising. Whereas in other cultures, I see like it's there is just an honesty. Sometimes it is too much for sure. Like there's a million examples, million and
Yeah.
one examples of this, but it is more of like the oh well I see this and this is reality and people are honest with each other and then I think it keeps people in check for what they want as well, so at least they're aware of it and they make their own decisions based on more of the reality. But then the things you say I completely agree with as well, that like maybe there is a
Yeah.
thyroid issue. Maybe there is a medication they have to take for something else that's making them, excuse me, gain weight. So culturally across
Well, no,
different
but
countries,
again,
that's
though,
interesting.
I mean, I think there are cultural differences. I think, the whole world is skewing heavier than it did when food was scarce and you had to work really hard to get it.
Right.
I mean, and I'm talking about the developed world, of course.
Sure.
We're seeing this. I mean, my last, trips to Europe, I've seen similar changes, and I saw similar foods available that you can get here in the United States. And so I think, I don't think body acceptance causes, I mean, there's not a person that I've ever worked with who didn't already feel shame about their body. Not a one. I
Right.
mean, they're not coming in saying, I'm fine the way I am, and that's why I just eat whatever I want. That's not what's happening. And so adding on to shame, I don't believe that shame is a good long-term motivator. I think it can cause you to close down. I think it can cause you to avoid certain people. It can cause you to avoid certain activities and
Hmm.
to feel bad about yourself. And if food happens to be one of the ways that you soothe that, I think it's counterproductive. So
Right.
I think there are definitely cultural differences in body size and the way that people perceive bodies. But I think what's happening all over the world is that we have this perception that there is one right body size to be. That's why we even have words like overweight, because it assumes that there is a weight to be and some people are over it. I mean, it even,
Right.
and you've used the
Right.
other O word, the word obesity, which is really pathologizing body size. It makes body size a disease. And this is the cultural phenomenon that we face now, which is that certain bodies are assumed to be diseased, and therefore other people think they have a right then to judge those bodies or shame those bodies or fix those bodies. To circle all the way back to where we started, diets don't work. And so I'm not sure what people think that they're going to accomplish by pointing this out. We'd be a lot better off if
Right.
people didn't wait 4 or 5 decades to get to the point where they want to learn how to make decisions consciously about their eating. If the
Right.
work that I do, if I could do this, I do teach it at a university, but if I could get to younger children and families and get to people before they have gotten into this cycle of body shame, dieting, restricting, lower metabolism, cravings, binging, more dieting. This is something that people will do for decades before they finally get to me. If we could stop that way earlier in the course, we'd
Right.
be much, much better off.
Yeah, there's definitely nothing that I would disagree with. I think one thing where I'm really loving how we're finding our way and common ground and not is because, to be clear, I definitely don't think shaming anyone is the way forward here. And I don't, and maybe I misspoke, but do you think perhaps because I do think there is a huge chasm between like unhealthy, disordered, disconnect eating and shame. I think there's a giant middle ground here where I think awareness and honesty is
Yeah.
is is something, and that's more what I had in mind for what I see in different European countries. And I would definitely agree with you. That is, I'm sure in some family friend environments that there's a shame component, and on those situations, I would agree with you that that is unhelpful. That people don't want to feel like they're rejected by the people they love the most, and obviously that's just going to create more problems. But
Mm.
do we agree that in the middle of these two ends, that there is a level of awareness that would be more helpful than just pretending that a growing problem isn't a problem?
If you're talking about somebody else telling you that you need to do something, I would say, even if they don't do it in a shaming way, I think oftentimes, they do it in a loving way. I really care about you. I'm worried about you. And I think you need to change your body. there's just not a person I've worked with who doesn't already want to change their body.
Right.
I worked with somebody once at one of our mindful eating retreats, and she said she's in a large body. She said, as long as I'm on a diet, as long as people actively see me saying, "Oh no, I can't have that." Oh, no, as long as they think I'm acting out the behaviors of a dieter, they leave me alone. They don't criticize me, they don't shame me. But as soon as they see me eating anything they don't think I should have, then they want to start giving me advice. And
Right.
that's not a great place to live. And I would repeat again that it's very stressful to feel that you're being judged by other people. We're a social animal, and
Mm.
acceptance has a huge effect on how we thrive and survive in a world when you're really pretty helpless without your community. And so
Right.
this idea that outcasting people, that othering people actually helps them, is problematic. Now, having said that, my role in the lives of many of the people that I work with is to be a voice of compassion and acceptance. And in that milieu, then we can begin to really look at these issues. People who don't know anything about this or don't really know what the behaviors or the drivers are, which I would say is the vast majority of people, can't really help people. They're not motivating people, they're othering them. And so I think
Right.
when they can get in an environment, a coaching environment like we can provide, that's where change can really occur. And whether that changes a person's body size is not my business. My business is to help them heal their relationship with food and to see what happens to their lives when they're able to move out of that place where eating and food and dieting and body shame is taking up so much space.
That's really great, and I am starting to shift how I look at some of this, and I really appreciate you staying with me on this topic. Um, and so I want to be respectful of your time as well. So I have a question. So if we're in agreement, and you were saying that you really hope that people before the 4 decades of yo-yo dieting and shame from failing at all these diets, that they could have come to a realization earlier, but then you're also saying that nobody in their life can try to shine a light on it because that's shaming and bad for them. Then where would you recommend it? I'll give you a random, like a made up example. Let's say there is someone that has a child who's maybe in their teens, or I don't know, 20s. You know what I'm trying to say.
Mhm.
And they see that they're actually eating very unhealthily. They're starting to gain a lot of weight. They're being more sedentary, like all these things. Like, how would someone in that person's life give them an awareness to try to help them make these better decisions, opposed to just saying like, no, things are fine, and then just watching this
Yeah.
problem go into 4 decades? Like, is there a way to do that?
Yeah, no, I think you're talking about that middle ground again. So there's a big
Yeah.
middle ground between um you're fine and I don't care what happens here you got to do something about this. Even young
Right.
children are very body conscious. I would
Sure.
say bullying is quite outright in young children. They're already aware. I believe very strongly that the home, the family should be a place of unconditional acceptance. Unconditional acceptance. I love you exactly the way you are. You don't need to change a thing. And hey, let's go out and throw a ball. Let's go hiking. You want to learn how to play pickleball? I mean, there are things. A lot of times with children, they're not the ones going out and doing the shopping. They're not the ones doing the cooking or making decisions about where the family eats. So a family, parents who are becoming conscious of this can help create an environment that supports these behaviors.
Right.
Um, you know, and again, I know we always kind of we keep going to get more nuanced and more complicated, but many of the people that I work with who actually have binge eating disorder, which is, not exactly what we've been talking about this whole time, but many of them, Their binge eating started when they were a child and they were in a stressful environment, a divorce situation or abuse situation or neglect situation,
Hmm.
and they were literally using food to help them cope and manage their emotions because they didn't have access to other ways of doing that.
Right.
Adding onto that trauma by now saying that your body is wrong is not helpful. So again, it's nuanced here, but I'm not saying that every child who's larger has trauma. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying that, again, just telling a child that they need to lose weight is absolutely not going to be effective. It's
Right.
not going to help them.
Perhaps
They need love and yeah.
yeah, I wasn't trying to go towards the child parent dynamic. I think so. I was trying to struggle with that, but I understand what you say or what you're
Yeah.
saying, and yeah, because I was wondering like if there is that middle ground, but it's super interesting from what you've seen from your clients, from like I was bullied a little bit, and what I was during that time I was overweight or however you'd like to call it, but I wasn't even like one of the bigger kids. So I
Mhm.
think I understand the pain of going through that, of when someone calls you fat or calls you overweight or things like that, because
Yeah.
you are aware of it, I think, on the like below the surface, but sometimes there's a disconnection, and it really was, I think, some of that of realizing how I was being treated, some of it that spurred on later on, that I didn't want that to come back, and it's
Yeah. Yeah.
but I'm saying that's my experience. I don't think anyone should have to go through it because it's brutal. So that's why
Right. Yeah,
I could
that's
I could
right. So that's
yeah, so
that's it. I mean,
that's where I completely agree
yeah.
with you, and I'm trying
Yeah.
to like really thread a needle here for
Yes.
like how someone can help someone they love and care about, either a child or a friend or whatever. And yeah,
Yeah.
and it seems that you're pretty firm that like this should only come from the person internally and not
Well,
from an
right.
external factor.
I don't think you fix stigma by changing your body size. You don't fix weight stigma by becoming smaller. All that does is move you into the privileged group.
Right.
That's not the problem here. The problem is the stigma itself. So, we have to get really clear that judging other people by their body size, by anything external, anything that we can't know deeply, is really inappropriate. It's really about curiosity and acceptance and love and unconditional support. So, I hear what you're saying, and I really sense that you have a great compassion for people, and you
Yeah.
really want to know, how do I help somebody? And I think my simplest answer is to be there for them, to be a support system. They don't need another person pointing it out. They don't need another lecture. They don't need, shopping advice. What they
Right.
might need is
Right.
somebody who's willing to go for a walk and slow down their own pace for a bit while they're you know building up their stamina. They might need
Right.
somebody who wants to help them develop other interests and get out a little bit more and do other things. Not that I know lots of people in large bodies who have big vibrant lives. I mean, they don't
Sure.
need help with a bigger life. They need help with more balance in their life, more rest, more whatever. So I think,
Right.
again, it just points out that we don't know what somebody's behaviors are. We don't know what their experience is. We don't know what their choices are from the outside. I feel very, very, very privileged to do my work because I know, I get to talk to people. I get to hear more below the surface what's really going on. And
Hmm.
I just feel bad for them when people outside the situation that don't really know all these things are just telling them something that doesn't really make a difference.
That's great.
Your compassion, lead with your compassion. That's a huge strength you have. Your curiosity and your compassion will do much more for anybody you care about than any unsolicited advice.
That's great. I appreciate that. You can definitely tell that your any clients are coming to you are finally going to be heard and listened to. Whereas if they're taking any of these diets from YouTube or wherever, they're going to have short-term results that doesn't take their life or their emotions or their experience into account
Yeah.
at all. And I think, yeah, I'm glad you could see my compassion for people I've known that were overweight, and you can tell that they're struggling with it. You can tell that
Mhm.
they that like even if they're living their lives, they're always saying something, or there's a little bit of biting, like you know what I mean. Like you can tell that they're struggling with their own body image, and when you try to reach out and try to lend a hand, you're right. It's not really taken
Mhm.
well, even if it comes from a place of love. And I learned that a long time ago. And so I was trying to see your perspective, if there was the secret sauce of the right
Mhm.
frame of combination of words to make. And yeah, you really answered it for me, that like if you love that person, the answer is just to love them. And if they ask
Yeah.
for help, or they want to join you for a run or the gym sometime, then to be there when they want. And if not, then well, that's their journey, and not ours.
Wow. We came full circle here. I love this. What a great conversation. I think you are voicing what a lot of people feel and experience, and I think that's such a great conversation to have, and I'm glad we were able to have it.
Yeah, I really appreciate you being here. I'm automatically thinking different of this whole thing than when we started. Like I could see you pulling back a little bit, because when I ask these things, I'm really trying to get at the heart of something, and I appreciate you staying with me this whole way. So Dr. May, I really appreciate you being with me today.
Thank you for the privilege.
So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you did enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.